Hi, my name's Jim. I'm a Brooklyn-based photographer. I've been making images for a really long time. I started out shooting film, and the technology that we use today would seem like science fiction to my 13-year-old self. But for all that, the elements that go into making a good exposure and a good composition haven't changed at all. So while you can take pretty much any modern camera, set it to automatic, and get good pictures, well, you'll get good exposures. I think composition is maybe another story. There are other modes on your camera, including the big scary M for manual. Is it only for pros? Is it even worth understanding? Let's find out. So before we talk about how to shoot in manual, we should probably talk about whether or not you should shoot in manual. While there's definitely value in understanding the exposure triangle, the three elements that go into making a good exposure, I think it's much more important to understand composition and to learn how to see. If you're just starting out, worry about composition first. Understand its rules, thirds, curves, lines, and understand when to break them, and let the camera figure out the exposure. Keep shooting in automatic or in one of the other camera specialty modes. If, however, you're feeling good about your compositions and the thing that might be holding you back a little bit is elements of your exposure, then maybe manual's right for you. So why would you want to shoot in manual mode? Why not just let the camera make all the exposure decisions? Well, sometimes you can. But in many cases, you may want to emphasize a particular element in your composition. Or you may want to brighten or darken your image slightly. Perhaps you're shooting a sunset, and if you shoot at correct exposure, you lose all the color from the sky. On most modern cameras, you'll have a setting called exposure compensation, and it seems like that could kind of take care of this for you. It can make your image a little brighter or a little darker relative to how your camera is metering the situation you're in. The problem you may run into with exposure compensation is that you don't control how the camera makes that compensation. The method that it chooses may have a negative impact on your composition. So if you'd like to be able to take full control over the way your exposure is made, maybe manual is right for you. Let's talk about it. Exposure compensation aside, there are three main settings that you adjust in manual mode, and together they determine how your image is exposed. The combination of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO are what we refer to as the exposure triangle. Understanding it and how to use it to adjust your image's exposure will give you complete control over your creative process. They're referred to as a triangle because if you want to maintain the same exposure but change one of those settings, you have to make an inverse change to one or both of the other two. These three elements are inextricably tied together. So let's take a look at each one, what it does, and what other effects it may have on your image. One last thing to talk about quickly before we dive into the exposure triangle, and that's light meters. In almost all modern cameras, it's represented as a scale where the center means a correctly exposed image. If it's oriented horizontally, the steps to the left are progressively darker, the steps to the right are progressively brighter. If the scale is vertically oriented, up is brighter and down is darker. When the meter is reading right in the middle, your exposure is correct for however your camera is measuring the scene. It's nice to be able to refer to the meter to know when your camera thinks you have the correct exposure, and then you can adjust up or down from there. Let's talk about ISO. On modern digital cameras, the ISO controls how sensitive your camera's sensor is to the light it's receiving. It has its origins in the ISO ASA ratings for film sensitivity. We're going to be talking a lot about stops of light. You don't need to know what a stop is exactly, other than to say it's the unit in which photographers measure light. A very low ISO setting like 100 means you're going to need a lot of light to make your image. Where if you're in a much dimmer situation, you might use a much higher ISO, like 1600 or 3200. That'll allow you to make the greatest use of the light that's available. So at this point you might be saying to yourself, why not just crank the ISO all the way up and then I'll have plenty of light to shoot with no matter what. A recurring theme throughout this video is going to be that you can change the ISO, but it comes at a cost. Using a very high ISO like 1600 to 3200 will let you shoot in very dim situations, but the price is you'll have a very noisy image. A grainy image is what we would say if we were talking about film. If instead you want to go to the other end of the spectrum and switch to a very low ISO, like say 100, you'll get a very clean image, but it's going to be much darker, so you're going to need a lot more light. You may need to use a flash or some other light source to add light to your scene. Generally speaking, the higher the ISO, the less light you need, but the more noise you'll have. The lower the ISO, the less noise you'll have, but the more light you need. One thing to be aware of is that even though you've put your camera into manual mode, ISO may still be automatic. So if you want to set that manually too, you may need to go find where in the menu system of your particular camera you make that change to make it be a particular number, 400 or 800 or whatever it is you want to use. Generally speaking, I try to work between 100 and 3200. My camera can go much higher, of course, but I try to avoid a very high ISO if I can. Of course, if you are shooting film, all of this is moot because the ISO is what the film says it is and you can't change it anyway. Another recurring theme is going to be where do you change this on your camera, and that I can't tell you. It's going to be different on every camera. Some will have a dial that's specific for ISO. Some you'll have to find it in your camera's touchscreen or in the menus somewhere. But wherever it is, if your camera has a manual setting, there'll be a way to set the ISO to a specific number. So that's one element of the exposure triangle that you need to understand in order to shoot in manual. Now let's go talk about aperture. Let's talk about the aperture setting and how it affects your images. The aperture describes how wide the opening at the back of the lens is that lets light through to your camera's sensor. It's referred to as the f-value or the f-stop, and it's measured on an inverse scale. An f-stop of 1.2 would be a very wide opening that would let through a lot of light, or an f-stop like f32 would be a very small opening that would let almost no light through. Let's take a look at this lens as an example. This is an older Nikkor zoom lens, and the aperture adjustment happens at a ring at the back of the lens. On this lens, the widest aperture is f3.5 and the smallest is f22. If we look through the lens, we can see that the opening is somewhere in the middle right now at about f8. But if I turn it this way and stop it all the way down to f22, we see the opening becomes very small, just barely a pinhole. If we go the other way and open it all the way up to f3.5, we can see that the opening gets much larger and lets through lots of light. So we can use the size of this opening to make our images brighter or darker. A smaller opening lets in less light and darkens your image. A larger opening lets in more light and brightens your image. As with everything else though, that adjustment comes at a price. The wider you open your aperture, the more shallow your depth of field becomes. Depth of field describes how much of the depth of your image is in focus from front to back. In this first image, we're at a fairly wide aperture at f4, and we're focused on the trolley. We can see that that's in focus, but it falls off very quickly and the middle and background elements are out of focus. If instead we shift our focus to the midground, now we can see that the dog is in focus, but the foreground and background elements are out of focus. If instead we focus on the elephant all the way in the background, now the midground and the foreground elements are out of focus. This effect is exaggerated more as you get closer and closer to the element that you're focusing on, and also by how long a focal length you're using. A longer focal length will exaggerate the depth of field. So to sum it up, a much wider aperture, smaller f number, means a much brighter image, but a much shallower depth of field. A smaller f number means a darker image, but a much broader depth of field. One thing to be careful about, if you go all the way up to higher f numbers with very small openings like f22 or f32, is something called chromatic aberration. It's where in the very contrasty areas of your image, The line between bright and dark elements might have some color distortion around its edges. On most older cameras, the aperture is changed by adjusting a ring at the back of the lens. On modern cameras, there's sometimes a separate dial for it. Sometimes you have to go to the user interface of the camera. You'll have to find where that is on your camera. That's 2 down. Let's talk about the last element, shutter speed. Let's talk about shutter speed. The last part of the exposure triangle is shutter speed. Shutter speed describes how long the shutter curtain stays open and allows light to hit your camera's sensor or film. No matter how you adjust it, most cameras will have a 1 somewhere in their shutter speed settings. That 1 represents a 1-second shutter speed. The shutter will stay open for 1 second and then close. In one direction from that 1, you get multiple second exposures. You might have a 2-second, a 10-second, a 30-second. On my camera, it goes all the way up to 900 seconds. That's about 15 minutes. That's a very long exposure. In the other direction, you'll get fractions of a second. So 1/4 of a second, 1/10th, 1/125th, 1/1000th. On my camera, it goes up to 1/8000th of a second. That's a very fast shutter speed, more than enough to freeze the wings of a hummingbird. So the longer the shutter curtain stays open, the brighter your image gets. A shorter opening means a darker image. And the price for change in this case is A, the brightness or darkness of your image relative to your shutter speed, but also motion blur. As the shutter speed gets longer and longer, you'll find that things moving in your image will blur. Here we can see that with a slow shutter speed, the fish moving through this image are blurry. Increasing the shutter speed freezes the motion of the fish. One thing to be careful of here is that motion blur is exaggerated as you zoom in further and further. A good rule of thumb is to never shoot at less than 1 over the focal length of your lens. So if you're using a 24mm lens, the nearest setting on your camera for shutter speed is probably 1/30th of a second. And you want to go to the nearest one or over, not under. So you would never shoot at less than 1/30th of a second. If you're using a much longer lens, like a 600mm lens to shoot birds with or something, you would never shoot at less than 1/600th of a second. In fact, with a lens that long, I would probably never shoot under 1/1000th of a second. The problem is the tiny shakes in your hand or from pressing the shutter button will translate into motion blur for your whole scene. On most cameras, if there's even only one dial, the thing it controls will be shutter speed. But on some, even for that, you may have to go into the menu system of your camera. So that completes the exposure triangle. Now let's put it all together. So now that we know all about ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, let's put them all together and make an image. First, let's set our focal point. I'm going to make an image of my little Millennium Falcon. So let's focus on the leading edge of that. Right off the bat, the exposure looks good. The meter says this is a good exposure, but there's some things we need to address. First off, let's take a look at the shutter speed. That's way too slow, especially with an 85mm lens. With that lens, we'll want a shutter speed at least 1/100th of a second. But I want it even a little faster than that for some padding, so let's bump it up to 1/250th of a second. Now though, my image is way too dark. My aperture is already open as wide as it goes, so the only thing we can adjust is the ISO. 1600 looks pretty good. But I want more than just the edge of the Millennium Falcon in focus, so I'm going to stop my camera down to f4 to get a little more of it. Now the image is too dark though, so we have to nudge the ISO back up. 6400 looks pretty good. It's a bit high, but not so high that it'll ruin my image. There, that's it, that looks perfect. On second thought though, I think I like the shallower depth of field better. So let's open the aperture back up to f1.8. Now of course my image is too bright again and we need to bring the ISO back down to 1600. There, that's perfect. So that's it. That's all there is to it. Now you know everything you need to know to be able to shoot in manual. If this was helpful, please let me know in the comments below. If you have questions, you can ask them there too. And of course, if I got anything wrong, I'm sure you'll let me know. I don't have sponsors or anything, so I guess this video is sponsored by me. So if you're going to be in the New York area anytime soon, or you want to pay for me to travel out of it, you can go to my website at jbpix.co, and there you can ask a question, get more information, or even book a portrait session. But before you do that, of course, hit the like button and the subscribe button and the little bell so you'll know when I release another video. That's it for me. See you next time. Cheers.